Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask people who know what's going on in research and education, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original higher education marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketing.com. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. The National Health and Medical Research Council has adopted a new open access policy, and it really is open access. As of next year, publications based on research it funds must be open access from pub date. It's a big step forward for Australian research, putting the NHMRC way in front of the Australian Research Council, which still allows a 12-month publisher's embargo. To explain what it means and where Australia now fits in international OA, I'm joined by Ginny Barbour. Professor Barbour is co-lead of QUT's Office for Scholarly Communications and Director Open Access Australasia. In February, she moves to become Editor-in-Chief of the Medical Journal of Australia. Ginny Barbour, thanks for sparing the time, and I know how busy you are.
Thanks very much. We're pleased to be here.
Can I start by asking, what has the NHMRC decided to do, and where does it fit with what the European open access movement does, and indeed with what President Biden has just announced for US federally funded research?
Yeah, so the NHMRC has announced that they are going to require immediate open access for the research that they fund. And that means immediately from the first time of online publication, whether it's an advanced early online or whether it's the final version of record. And it will require that the publication has a Creative Commons attribution license. So that's the license that allows the most use and reuse. So there are two routes to this. You can either do it through publishing in a journal that makes the research open access, or you can do it by putting the author-accepted manuscript into your university repository. But one version of that, either the version of record or the author-accepted manuscript, must be made immediately open access. And so this comes into effect immediately for grants that are announced from now on, that are currently, that you're applying from now on. But in effect, of course, that will be a few years before those papers come out from those. And for ongoing grants, there's a grace period 2024. So this is a very strong open access policy. It's very specific. So in some ways, it is absolutely aligned with what Coalition S in the UK is doing and Europe. In fact, the NHMRC has joined Coalition S, so this will further strengthen what they're doing. And it's much more specific, in fact, than what President Biden announced a couple of weeks ago, which was the need for immediate public access, but they did not specify licenses, and they weren't as directive about how the research was to be made open. So this is a strong policy, and it's quite specific and I think very pragmatic as well.
It was a while coming. The NHMRC started talking about this well over a year ago, and I think at the beginning of last year said that they were putting consideration on hold. And so now, but now they're full steam ahead. I wonder, insofar as it's discussed, do you think the medical research community were happy with such a bold step?
I think a lot of what happened was just refining the language of the policy. They got a fair amount of feedback from the university sector, from publishers, from individuals. There was some concern when it was first announced for consultation that the wording wasn't really that clear, and I think the intent was still there, but it wasn't clear how it was to be fully articulated. So I think most of the work that's gone on in the past few months is really making the language clear. And also, for example, doing things to make sure that if you're publishing Indigenous research, there are specific guidelines for that the research doesn't have to be under exactly the same conditions. And also looking at what's been happening with regard to, for example, the read and publish agreements that the Council of Australian University Librarians are negotiating, ensuring that authors who are publishing under those agreements can comply with this policy. So I think most of what happened was just a pragmatic reworking of the wording and the application to make sure it was appropriate for the Australian research landscape.
Carl have just come out this morning endorsing the move.
Yes.
I think they're the first, I think, of organised groups, apart from Open Access Australasia, to back it. It's it is a bold step in the Australian context.
It is, but in the medical research context actually it's not that bold. So first of all, you know, we've had the most fantastic example, you know, of the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, it's never been clearer that we need immediate access to medical research. And I think that this is putting an HMRC is basically saying, you know, we need to be prepared for whatever comes next. We know there'll be medical emergencies in the future. And as we've commented, for example, in relation to President Biden's approach, we don't want to be in the position where funding agencies and international scientific organizations are kind of having to beg for access to research that is really critical for managing health emergencies. So I think this is just a really appropriate step for our times.
Insofar as it's possible to speculate, do people now have a choice between an institutional repository or pay an article processing charge with an established journal? Will that, do you see this moving the split between the two, where people choose to go?
I think what we're going to see is an increased diversity of approaches. We already have that within the Australian publishing landscape. So repositories are very strong in Australia, although they haven't had any concerted government investment for quite some time. And to be honest, they could do with it. I think that would be a good step forward, would be a good investment in repositories to make sure they're fully interoperable with the global repository ecosystem. So that's one thing that I think is worth thinking about. I think that there are already a number of, there are many open access journals that don't charge an article processing fee, the so-called diamond ones. And of course, those will be immediately compliant, although bear in mind, it would be important that they apply the license appropriately. And then we have the fully gold open access journals, the Born OA journals such as PLOS and Biomed Central and such like, that authors will be able to publish in. But the work that CALL's doing with their read and publish agreements is vastly expanding the options for authors to publish in journals that were previously subscription, and that you don't have to pay an individual charge yourself because that's covered by the agreement that your library has with CALL. What I think will be really important is to make sure that we don't actually end up with all of those journals not transitioning to open access, and also just to have a cost containment on any costs associated with publishing openly.
It does seem, looking at the international debate, that the major for-profits are, if not conceding that the old model is going to change, they're certainly adapting.
They're adapting very well. They're making a lot of money out of this. I mean, you know, and in fact, when President Biden's open public access policy was announced, one of the first publishers to come out and talk about it was Springer Nature, and they said, well, you know, of course we'll comply if you give us enough money. You know, this is kind of getting a bit ridiculous. I think we have to be clear that, you know, publishers are a service for the research community. They provide a, you know, important service, but there are other ways to have that, you know, service provided. So for example, if the issue is to make something open via a repository, then there can be there's no cost associated with the publication. I think the publishers really need to prove what they're doing is worthwhile. And, you know, some of the article processing charges we're seeing at the moment for the Nature journals, for example, are just extraordinary and, you know, are out of the reach even of the most well-funded Australian universities. So I think that we need to have a serious conversation about cost containment as these policies come into place.
It is an immensely profitable industry. If you dig deep enough and you look at the Elsevier numbers, for example, they do make a bomb of dough.
Yes, for sure. And there are all sorts of reasons for for that to be the case. I mean, there's no question that publishing does cost money. And I've worked in for-profit journals, I've worked in not-for-profit journals, and if you want to support a peer review service, largely speaking, you do need to have some costs associated with it. Now, there's a big debate to be had about the free labour that academics provide for peer review, but there are costs associated, but the costs are not as high as some of the publishers would have us believe. And one of the problems, of course, is for highly selective journals. Journals get no money for the research that they don't publish. So do we need to have a think about how those papers are managed? There's a whole issue around how the system is managed that really doesn't fit for purpose nowadays. So And of course, the profit margins, I think, are excessive. So what I really want to see as we go forward is to have really strong conversations with publishers about what are reasonable costs associated with the service that we want provided.
All that competition sorted out, which there doesn't appear to be an enormous
It's not
amount.
doing. And so I think one of the advantages, of course, of being part of consortia such as Coalition S, which the NHMRC will now be part of, is that they are putting a whole set of processes and tools in place that help support that. So, for example, they have one which allows for price comparisons. So if you're negotiating, you can look to see price comparisons between different publishers. Now, it's managed very carefully. So, for example, the publishers can't use it to, fix their prices or to, to kind of get a competitive advantage. But it provides some insight into the actual costs associated with the services, and I think that hopefully will begin to drive down prices.
What about the old argument that there is a world of difference between publishing in the most famous journal in the world and putting your article in your university's repository?
Well, I mean, you can do both, of course. I mean, that's the beauty of repositories nowadays. So you can publish in your journal, and you can still put a copy in your institutional repository. Most content that's in university repositories is also in a journal somewhere. So if you choose to want to read the final version of record that's typeset, and you've got a subscription to that journal, you can still read it. But if you just want the, as it were, the unformatted version of the article, author accepted manuscript, then that's freely available. So I think what we see is that, and what we know actually is that if you have multiple versions, that actually increases usage overall. So there's no reason for publishers to be worried about the fact that repositories are taking away eyeballs from them. In fact, we know that it increases usage overall. So I think what we should, hopefully think is that, multiple copies of an article maximize its impact, not reduce it.
There's a new research from Koki at Curtin University on that very point that came out earlier in the week. What about data? The NHMRC's position now applies to data, but I've had the sense in the last few years that in a lot of ways, particularly in STEM, it's data that publishers, the big publishers, are particularly interested in.
Yeah, so the NHMRC haven't revised their policy with regard to data this time. I think that is the next body of work to happen. They've had a policy for a while around access to data, but they haven't revised it. What is really new recently is what the White House has put out is that they are requiring immediate access to the data behind research publications. Now, that's a huge piece of work. We already know that, well, we don't have enough people who are experts in data management to support that. It's often not really clear what you mean by the data behind a paper. If it's for an astrophysics paper, is that every piece of information you've collected, or is it just a spreadsheet for something much simpler? So I think there's that some of the commentary that's coming out about the US policy is exactly that. How do we make sure that we provide sufficient funds to curate and manage and make that data appropriately available? And that is actually talked about in the memorandum that went to the heads of the federal agencies. But I think what we'll need to see is what that really looks at. It will require investment, and that's a clear message, I think, also for the funders here. We have to invest in data infrastructure.
Is government across any of this, do you think, in Australia, do you think?
Yes, I think so. And I think that there's some interest in with this new government about what this all might mean. We know, of course, we're already seeing interest in reforming of the ARC, for example. So I would hope that they are looking at this as one of their policy areas. I hope that they will be taking a lead from the academic community about what's really needed. And of course, we know that Cathy Foley is looking at open access as one of her priorities. So I think there is interest in it. I think what the message that we would be really keen to see from Open Access Australasia is to support a diversity of approaches, but sending a policy signal like this from the NHMRC is really important, because that really helps institutions to think about how they again apply policies with their own institutions.
My experience is that it is not, open access in general is not an issue that is top of mind in the broadly defined academic community. It's not going to go away.
No, and you know, I think there's been one of the challenges we've had with open access is that people it's often been thought of as an ideological discussion. In fact, it's a pragmatic discussion. You know, when journals were first published back in the 1600s, the most efficient way to get information out there was to put it in a print journal and, you know, basically, you know, send it out to all the members of your academy. That turned into the paper journals that we now have. But we now live in an internet age where we're actually really efficient at disseminating information online. The question is just how we do it in the way that, you know, that has a business model that both supports that to happen, but also has the, I guess, the checks and balances associated with it to make it open appropriately. So I don't think this is ideology. I think we're just basically catching up with the possibilities of the internet now, and putting the processes and policies around that to make that happen.
Which is a generational shift. I mean, it took a long time for newspapers. I mean, newspapers are only now really starting to successfully grapple with it. And the music industry had to virtually destroy itself to get the recorded music industry to come back. Yeah. And you know, I often think that The Guardian is a very interesting example of a newspaper that's very successfully done this, which is they have a model which is akin to one of the ones that's that's being used in scholarly publishing, the subscribe to open, which is that you need a certain number of people to subscribe, as in subscribe in this term meaning underwrite, to make something open for everybody. And The Guardian has applied that very successfully. And, you know, they've now essentially turned most of their publishing open. That's a model we could be looking more carefully at in the academic landscape, because we don't need to think, I think what we do need to move away from is the individual article processing charges that academics are expected to pay, because that's clearly leads to inequity in who can publish. NHMRC have said, and I hope I have this right, that you can pay article processing charges out of grant funding.
Yes, that's correct. It's not a line item, but it never has been in Australia. It is in some funders. In the UK, for example, that can happen. But no, they say very specifically you can use your grant funds to pay for article processing charges if you need to.
And what about the Creative Commons attribution in the new agreement? Is that significant?
It's very significant. So one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, for example, is the difference between free and open access. So free access is a PDF that you can grab off the internet. It's got no licensing associated, or may not even have copyright associated with it, and it can go away at any time. Whereas something that is put online with a Creative Commons attribution license on it specifies the use and reuse, and it specifies it in perpetuity. So what we have seen to some extent during the pandemic is a real issue with publishers making stuff freely available, as was called for by the White House and other scientific agencies, and then taking it down. And this has happened in other epidemics. Happened during one of the Ebola outbreaks. So research that was open was then withdrawn. Was free was withdrawn. If it's fully open, that means that it's open in perpetuity. So the CC BY license is really important. It doesn't take anything away from the authors. It's still, in fact, it kind of firms up their rights because it ensures that they have the right to attribution. But it clearly specifies what can be done with it. So I think that's a really great move forward, and that is the license that Coalition S specifies as well.
Has it been tested in the courts in any similar jurisdiction to ours?
I believe there has been legal discussion around this, and I think it both in the UK and the US, in Australia, it is in alignment with current intellectual property law. I'm not a lawyer, but that is my understanding. I've not seen any publishers pushing back against it. What we are seeing is publishers, to be honest, sometimes causing confusion by offering authors a different types of license. So you can have Creative Commons attribution with a non-commercial, so which means you can do anything you like with it, but you can't sell it. No derivatives means you can't break it up. There's different versions of these. These actually aren't very helpful. And for the research publications, authors don't get they don't get reimbursement for these kind of articles anyway. So having something as non-commercial, to be honest, really doesn't make sense. What is important about the NHMRC policy, though, is that for Indigenous research, they do say very specifically you can use a different license. So, for example, they suggest the no derivatives one, which means that if you publish a piece of Indigenous research, it should be published in its entirety without it being broken up and put into different different publications, for example. And I think that's a very important acknowledgement of the need to be appropriately sensitive to Indigenous research.
Do such licenses apply to data?
Well, yeah, no, yes and no. There are different licenses associated with data. You can't really put a CC BY license on data. You can. What's usually done is the CC0 license. I don't think we're really at that point of having that sophisticated a discussion yet about what license we should be putting on data.
Is there grounds in Australia for super repositories? I mean, could there be an Australian medical journal repository? No, I'm sorry, strike that. An Australian medical repository that takes the form of an online journal?
Well, that's a very interesting question because so in the US, the Biden policy said that the research was to be made available via a designated repository, by which most people think they believe they're talking about PubMed Central, which was the online archive that was set up it was set up more than 15 years ago, but essentially was where all the papers that were made available because of the previous White House directive in 2013, that's where they were all submitted. So there have been discussions here about an Australian PubMed Central or some equivalent. Although it says med, it actually includes many more than just medical papers. Another approach is to say, well, let's link up the Australian repositories in a really sophisticated way, in the way that happens, for example, in Europe through a thing called Open Air, or in South America, there's a similar system. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a new entity, but it could be just a sophisticated way of linking up what we've already got.
That would be a bit of work, I would imagine.
It would, but it's not impossible, and it relies, again, coming back to infrastructure. We have the infrastructure to do this kind of thing nowadays. We know the technical requirements. We don't have to reinvent things. There are good examples out there already.
Look, I know you're busy. I won't hold you up, but one last question. If the minister, and when I think about it, it could be one of about 4 ministers, asked you what needed to be done now nationally to follow the NHMRC lead, what would you tell him or her or they?
Well, first off, I would want to say we need to invest in a diverse open ecosystem. We need to have a national approach which encompasses all the options. So we need to invest in repositories. We should be investing in our local journals, and we should be supporting the types of read and publish agreements that CALL is doing. But we need to be doing it in a way that leads to, I think, a defined timeline of open access within, say, 5 years. So I'd like to see an approach that looks across the entire sector, links it all up and accepts that we want a diverse approach, but that we require investment in all those areas.
Which is a great point to finish on. Ginny, Barbour, thank you for sparing the time. I know you're busy, and I hope you can come and talk to us in the new year as this all unfolds. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.